What's up, everybody? Ron Placone here, reporting for Status Coup. So, this is interesting. Facial recognition software is something that has been uh, in my wheelhouse for a little bit now. I was part of a campaign to ban facial recognition, and turns out recently there was something that really made some waves when a woman was going to a concert at Madison Square Garden with her daughter. It was a holiday concert because 'tis the season, and she was turned away. She was escorted out of the venue because she is part of, she's an attorney, and the firm that she works with is part of a case that involves Madison Square Garden's parent company, and it's against Madison Square Garden's parent company. Now, to my understanding, this person who they escorted out, she actually doesn't even have anything to do with that case. It's just part of the firm she's a part of. But nonetheless, they scanned her facial recognition wise, and it set off a detection. And so they kicked her out of the venue. This has been making waves, and my guest, who's going to help me through this, she's the executive director over at Fight for the Future, an organization that I collaborate with, and she's also a brilliant musician. And we're going to be talking about her holiday album here too. And she recently was interviewed by Rolling Stone on this topic, so she knows it through and through. Please welcome to the show, Evan Greer. Evan, how are you?
Hey, Ron. Thanks for having me back on. Always happy to chat. I have to say, for the record, I'm technically just the director of Fight for the Future. Sarah Roth-Godet is our executive director.
Oh, thank you.
But who's keeping track?
So walk me through this story. I mean, I know you broke this down on Rolling Stone. So what all happened? I mean, I gave a brief summary there, but fill in any blanks.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so I think to get to this story, you actually have to back up a little bit. So back in 2019, Fight for the Future ran a campaign where we got more than 40 of the world's largest music festivals and concert promoters to say that they would not use facial recognition at their events. And I actually wrote a piece about that with Tom Morello from Rage Against the Machine, kind of declaring victory. Like, we prevented facial recognition from invading the music industry at a time when that was really likely to happen. But Madison Square Garden was kind of the holdout. To my knowledge, they are the only major concert venue in the country that's continuing to use this incredibly controversial and invasive facial recognition technology. And now this latest story just sort of shows exactly why that's just so absurd. But not just absurd, it's really worrying. Because I think this is kind of this particular instance where it's just so blatantly egregious, where it wasn't about safety or security or, they were stopping somebody who was a threat to concert goers. This was straight up a corporation acting out effectively a petty grievance or using this technology to essentially punish others who would dare to sue them. And I think it really points toward what's so worrying about private use of facial recognition. We've focused a lot on government and law enforcement use of facial recognition, which makes sense. The government can lock you up, they can throw you in jail, they can kill you. So it makes sense that we worry about what governments can do with this technology. But I think this story really shows that we need to be just as worried about what private corporations and powerful individuals and institutions can do with this technology. And this story, I think, really brings that into focus.
So let's just give a quick crash course here, though, for people who might not be familiar. Like, what's kind of the elevator on just why this technology is bad and the negative outweighs any potential positives by a lot?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, in this particular instance, we know it was used kind of to pull someone out of a crowd, right? And, some folks would say, well, there was a rule against her being there. She broke the rule. So, like, what's the big deal? And I think in some ways, like, that is true. But this points us toward, like, this is a rule that she would have gotten away with breaking and probably should have, because it wasn't actually a big deal, but didn't because of this technology. And that's exactly what's so worrying about it to me, is that it sort of enables enforcement of not just laws, but kind of rules or social norms in a sort of pervasive and automated manner. So imagine, you show up at a concert venue and you don't get in because they're like, actually, the 6 weeks ago when you were here, we caught you and your buddies rolling a joint in the bathroom. right? It's like every minor rule infraction that, like, for the most part, we kind of get away with in society, which is actually good because it kind of allows some wiggle room and incentivizes authorities to use their power to only deal with more serious stuff. Now, suddenly, with the push of a button, we can sort of have automated rule enforcement in a kind of mass scale. And what that does is it sort of, from my perspective, it kind of freezes our society. It doesn't allow for any wiggle room to test whether our rules and laws and norms are correct. And when you look at someplace like China, where they've been using facial recognition tied to a social credit system, where like literally we're like shaming people for walking down the street in their pajamas using facial recognition technology, you can start to see the like frightening outcome here. The other thing I'd say quickly is, we think a lot about facial recognition in this live context. It's really important that we think about all the other ways that this is being used. For example, we recently ran a campaign because Zoom was looking at implementing a facial recognition and facial analysis technology into Zoom. So imagine you're on a call with someone like a salesperson, and they're getting real-time information that's saying, oh, Evan looks disinterested. You should like change the conversation. Evan looks like she maybe thinks you're lying. You should like, change the tact of what you're saying. Imagine that in a job interview. Imagine that when the cops are interviewing you. Imagine that in, so many scenarios where this technology just sort of creates a power imbalance. And I think that's the thing to understand, is that there is no meaningful way to consent to this. A lot of times the industry will say, oh, well, all we need is just opt-in consent. And Madison Square Garden actually says, well, we have signs up that say, by being here, you're consenting to having our facial recognition used on you. That's not meaningful consent. This woman wanted to go see the Rockettes with her daughter. They perform at Radio City Music Hall. That's where they play. She didn't have a choice to go somewhere else and avoid the facial recognition. And certainly, going to see a concert is not necessarily a life or death matter, but start to imagine a world where all of the hospitals in your area use facial recognition. Are you really consenting to having facial recognition used upon you if you break your leg and have to go to the nearest hospital? That's not really meaningful consent. And that's why we need broad prohibitions on the use of this technology. And the specific policy that Fight for the Future has been calling for is a ban on the use of facial recognition in places of public accommodation. And that's a specific legal definition that's tied actually to the Americans with Disabilities Act. So think bars, restaurants, retail stores, places that are supposed to be open to the general public is where facial recognition should not be used. You want to use it in your home studio, Ron? I'm not going to yell at you or like send the Fed. I probably will yell at you, but I don't think the feds should kick in your door. But that's different than a place of public accommodation that's supposed to be for the general public. And we actually know that the city of Portland, Oregon passed an ordinance that does exactly that. It bans the use of facial recognition in places of public accommodation. And so we think New York City should follow suit and do the same. That would stop Madison Square Garden from doing this. But really, in the end, we need to recreate that at the federal level and then make it kind of a global norm. This is a global problem. Facial recognition is more like nuclear weapons than it is like alcohol or tobacco or something that can be, responsibly regulated. So that's why our position and the position of many experts in the field is that this is a technology that does need to be banned, largely in the same way that we think of something like nuclear or biological weapons.
Yeah, and one of the things I'd like to add to that is, and this is one of the things that Fight for the Future has really been on top of in exposing too, a lot of the kind of excuses people make for this stuff is very much unfounded. Like there's nothing out there that says facial recognition helped them catch a bad guy. That's never really happened. These databases too are extremely vulnerable. Can you speak to that for a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so, the thing to understand is like facial recognition is not magic. It's actually not even that complicated of a technology. Basically, it's matching. Does this look like this? It's a pretty simple way to think about it. But the way it does it is you have to have a massive database of photographs. And so that's why the government has largely done this using databases like driver's license databases or arrest databases of mugshot photos, et cetera. But in this case, we know Madison Square Garden clearly has their own database, and apparently somebody went and grabbed all of the profile photos of attorneys who were suing them from their law firm's websites and stuck them into that database. And that database itself is vulnerable. Somebody could hack it, gain access to not just those photos, but to the biometric face prints of those photos that the technology uses. And the reason that that's so concerning is as we head toward a world where our biometrics are used more and more, someone could use a biometric face print of you to unlock your phone or to pick up your kids from school or to log into your medical records if we start heading in a direction where we're using biometrics for access to sensitive information. So not only is it terrible for privacy and human rights and civil liberties, it's just also not actually a very good tool for security. And you're absolutely right. Like if Madison Square Garden had ever like caught a terrorist using this technology, don't you think they would be like all over TV, like talking about that instead of this case, which is just so blatantly egregious, right? But what I will say, because I think it's important to be real about this is, there will be, and there already have been some, and there will be more instances where this technology actually is used to catch a bad guy or to stop something. And we know, for example, facial recognition was used in the Capitol riots and actually was used to identify and arrest some of the people that participated in the Capitol riot. And like some people would say like, oh, well, that's a good, that's a justification. That shows that actually this technology is good and can be used for good. But I think it's so important that we take 2 steps back and just look at the bigger picture, right? In the end, we know that surveillance technology like facial recognition is disproportionately used on Black and brown folks, on activist communities, on human rights documenters overseas, et cetera. And so in the end, like facial recognition is going to hurt the people who the Capitol rioters were trying to disenfranchise much more than it's ever going to hurt the quote unquote bad guys, right? And so we need to always just keep that in mind of who is actually the most impacted by this. Sure, there will always be these sort of, edge cases or, high profile instances of, wow, well, look at this one crime. But you have to kind of weigh that against things like the immense suffering that comes with mass incarceration and over-policing of communities of color. You have to weigh that against the reality that, social movements and protest movements, facial recognition, you couldn't ask for a better suppression of social movement technology than facial recognition. The ability to just pick anybody out of a crowd at a protest. That's the type of stuff that I think we need to be really worried about. And then again, when you go back into the private sector and just think about ways that you walk past a billboard, the billboard knows who you are, they know what your income is, they know what your religion is, and they show you an ad based on who they know you are. Like the types of power and we're getting into like Blade Runner territory, with this stuff, like pretty quick. And so again, that's why, it's not about an individual thing. Like people often ask me like, well, what can I do to protect myself from facial recognition? And they want me to say like, put on a mask or like wear some makeup or like, don't go out of the house. And like the answer, unfortunately, is like, call your frickin' senator and tell them that we need policies that protect people from this incredibly dangerous and invasive technology.
So and again too, with every edge case we could point to where it's like, oh look, it kind of helped with a bad guy. It's like you could also probably point to not only all the themes you mentioned, but also there's going to be other edge cases where, well, okay, here's a cop who was trolling for nudes. So it's where can people go to learn more about this campaign?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so Fight for the Future has been running a kind of hub campaign site for a few years at banfacialrecognition.com. That's kind of like your one-stop shop. If you remember us from like the net neutrality days, that's kind of our like battle for the net. And what it does is, makes it really easy for you to write your lawmakers in support of legislation that would put a moratorium on government and law enforcement use of facial recognition and to call for policy prohibiting private use of facial recognition. We've got a few subpages there like ban facial recognition /stores, ban facial recognition /campus, where we've ran campaigns targeting colleges and universities, as well as retail stores. Our campaign actually got Walmart and Target and a number of other major retailers to say that they won't use this technology in their stores. They could certainly go back on that word in a few years, but that's helping slow down the commercial spread of this tech. So yeah, find us generally at fightforthefuture.org. Find me on all the places. But yeah, ban facial recognition is really the one-stop shop for getting involved in this fight.
So thank you so much. And before I let you go, I want to do something a little fun for the holidays here. Which, by the way, you are very festive. You're much more festive than myself, so thank you for that.
You're always festive, Ron. You're looking festive.
Thank you. But so back in my younger show-going days, which I think I think we're around the same age, but there was a singer-songwriter I liked called One Line Drawing, and one of the things that he always did was he had a little R2D2 toy on stage with him that participated in the songs. Now it turns out you can kind of literally collaborate with a robot, which is kind of what you did recently. So can you explain this holiday album that you have? Because I read some of the articles and I'm still not sure I fully understand it. So what did you do?
What did I do? I'm still asking myself that. And I genuinely don't know why I did this. And I think some people are also interpreting it as sort of like an endorsement of like the use of AI in art. And it's very much not that. Like if anything, this was sort of my like I can't look away from the horror experiment. But what I did is I used ChatGPT, which is, this kind of very popular sort of going viral new AI chatbot that everyone's been sort of talking about. And you can ask it all kinds of things. Like I could ask it, ChatGPT, what does Ron Placone think about Christmas music? And it'll tell me something. It may or may not actually be true. The way it works is basically it's very similar to the predictive text on your phone, where it's been trained on a massive language model, and it's effectively just predicting whatever the next word should be based on the word before it. And so it often does spit out very accurate results. It can write code, it can do all kinds of stuff, but it also is often very confidently wrong. And then it comes with all these ethical considerations of what does it mean when you can just ask an AI to write a press release and it gets pretty damn good at it. As somebody who writes press releases, at least in part for a living, that makes me a little nervous, right? But what I ended up doing with it is I asked ChatGPT to write the lyrics to Christmas songs. And then I wrote and recorded music to those Christmas songs. And then I put it out as an EP called Automated Christmas Joy, with a sort of dystopian Santa with like a surveillance eye thing on it. And but yeah, it came out pretty good, which is sort of alarming. And in some ways it was like we co-wrote it together, right? Because I very much led the AI with prompts. Like I asked it, write a Christmas song in the style of Blink 182, write a Christmas song called Christmas at the Gay Bar. And then with some of them, I would regenerate it like over and over again until I got something that I kind of liked.
Okay.
Or I would piece together like the best verse. But everything that came, everything that's there lyrically came out of the AI. In some cases, I pushed it to kind of give me what I wanted. But yeah, it's there. And again, I don't really know how to feel about this stuff. I think it's worrying. But then I also remember that when the synthesizer came out, everyone was like, oh my God, this is terrible. It's going to end music forever. No one's ever going to learn to play the guitar if you can just program a computer to do it. And obviously that's not true. And in the end, the synthesizer just became another tool like any other. And so I do wonder whether maybe that'll happen, but I fear for a world where, it's one thing if it's the lyrics, but we're heading toward a world where you'll be able to press a button and spit out a pop song complete with a robot singer. And, that someone would not be able to tell was written by a robot. And that freaks me out. And I don't know, what the regulatory response to that is, what the ethical response to that is. But I hope that this album at least kind of gets a conversation started, and the whole thing is a benefit for my organization, Fight for the Future, because we spend all year long trying to fight against artificial intelligence being used for harmful purposes. So I figured it was a good way to just, raise a little bit of money for our work and cope with some of my weird Christmas malaise, I guess you'd say.
But it's not going to be a permanent collaboration between you and the robot. You're still, for the most part, working solo.
I'm solo artist. We've had some creative differences, me and ChatGPT. So I don't know that we're going to be working together again. This might have been a one-time thing.
Lovely. So where's the best place people can go to get that album?
Yeah, it's up on Bandcamp, and you can just find me, Evan Greer, on Bandcamp. And yeah, Boing Boing and CNET and a few other places have a little write-up on it if you want to read more of my thoughts of why I made this monstrosity.
Evan, thank you so much for popping in, and thank you for illuminating this issue for us, and happy holidays.
Happy holidays. Thanks for having me, Ron.